In the church, this usually doesn't get received well, but there's not a lot of wisdom of knowing the church's history, of thinking biblically about music. It's, this is the music I like, this is the music I know, and I'm going to do it.
Well, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I have Dr. Erb with me.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Quick introduction on you. You have a DMA in choral conducting from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which you got in 2007, correct? You have an MUS, M-U-S?
Muse, yeah.
MUS, in choral conducting from Westminster Choir College at Runner University, which is in New Jersey, correct? Not in the Westminster in England. And you have a BMUS in music education, also from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. You have been a fellow of music at NSA since 2008, and you head up their concert choir and a variety of other music operations. And on top of that, you are a father and husband.
Yep, guilty as charged on all accounts.
Fair enough. So kind of starting at the beginning, did your parents work in the musical industry?
No, not at all. My mom sang in the church choir and did some music when she was younger, but neither of them did music much other than my mom singing. So, but she liked music. My dad would sing around the house, but that was about it.
As all dads do.
Yeah. Yeah, and kind of when I was 8, my mom asked if I wanted to join a boy choir. And so I said, okay. So I did, and started piano that year and church youth choir, and just kind of stayed with it.
And that's where the fascination with music started?
Yep. Age 8, I just this summer got to go back and see the rehearsal room where I first had rehearsals, which was kind of fun.
Yeah. What fascinates you about music, and especially the kind of music you create? So you do a lot of taking psalms and making them singable. Mm-hmm. What fascinates you about that kind of music specifically?
Well, I've been in choir since I was young and had good conductors, and you just get to interact with beauty, language, and history through all of it. But the act of singing together is just a delightful thing. It's a glorious thing, particularly when it's done well. And when I was younger, I wasn't thinking about it in Christian terms, but it's nonetheless delightful and enjoyable to do. And at that stage, you're just kind of, this is what I did, and so that's what I wanted to do. But there's something about, I've had so many, it's a constant for me because I'm always working with people singing, whether it's congregations that I know, or school boards back when I was teaching in public school a long time ago. But if you get people singing together, there are things that happen and walls that break down and interactions that are connected that is very hard to do in any other way. And you don't talk about it. You don't lay out a rationale, a worldview for it. You just do it. And when you do that, nobody cares what church you go to or if you go to church or not. I mean, it's not that you don't care, but while you're singing something that everyone enjoys singing or is learning together, you're all just one body, and it's a wonderful thing about music. The project of setting the Psalms, when I 20 some years ago, when I first wandered into the Reformed church world, and became more introduced to metric psalms. That was a wonderful learning process. I started chanting psalms as well. But with the metric psalms, I just found, as you compare them to a faithful translation of the Bible, they're often close, but not really it, or there's parts missing. And I just got thinking, well, I want to sing the word that's in the Bible. Not that I'm opposed to singing the other versions, but I want to sing that. And if I'm going to memorize it, I want to memorize that. And to my surprise, I guess I already knew this, but nobody's really done that congregationally over the history of the church. You have chant, which isn't composition; it's just a recitational formula. It's heightened speech. you have through composed settings for choirs, and then you have rhymed metered paraphrases for congregation. So standing in the musical streams that I was, chant and classical music and hymnody, I just started chiseling away and trying, and I'm up to 50 of those psalms, and it's been neat to see, from young kids to older folks to people on different continents, starting to pick them up and singing them, appropriating them sometimes in cultural differences. Recently saw a few being sung over in Zambia, just a whole different take on certain things, but they're singing the word, and hearing stories, whether it's people singing Psalm 23 at funerals, or being lost out on the Moscow Mountain, as some NSA students were years ago, and singing through psalms that they had memorized. It's a blessing to see that word dwelling in people richly, so that when life happens, as it will, that's what comes out of them, because that's what they've been drinking.
Yeah. What do you mean by metric psalms?
So when we sing a hymn, there's a poetic form that may be an A-B rhyme scheme or something. The end of every other line rhymes, or whatever the form is. There's 7 syllables, 8 syllables per line, and it's regular. And you have one tune, and it repeats itself for subsequent verses. It doesn't change with each successive verse, so it's not fit to the words particularly. Okay. So you can take a hymn that has a certain poetic meter, and if you take a tune that has that same structure, you can slap any set of text on it, which is very useful and helpful. And you find something that's often hymns, tunes, and hymn texts weren't written to go together. So we sing Amazing Grace to a tune that wasn't written for that. And so the metric psalms are psalms that someone will take the text out of the Bible and they rework it so it rhymes. And biblical Hebraic poetry doesn't rhyme, and it's not set with particular number of syllables per line. And so if the end of the first line you have the word sing, then the next point in the rhyme scheme you have to have something that rhymes with sing. Right. And so you have to start stretching and rewording things just to make that happen. In biblical poetry, you get parallelisms, an idea that's repeated similarly or negatively to contrast it. And a lot of times in metric psalmody, those will get conflated together. And so you lose the structural element of the original poetry as well.
You talked about a Christian way of writing music, of composing music. What do you mean by that specifically, and how does that distinguish itself from a non-Christian way? Yeah,
I mean, on the one hand, music is music. There are truths and realities that are grounded in the way God's created sound. The Overtone series exists whether you acknowledge God created it or not, just like metals have properties. So being Christian or not, you'll find that certain metals work for certain things and others don't. Right. I don't know anything about that, but that's true. And so, thinking Christianly is, one, it's grounding yourself in that. So many people think music is just whatever you like, and the music doesn't really matter as long as the words are biblical or Christian. But you can talk about tonal music, for instance, because it's the most primary relationships that exist in the way God's created sound. So the first interval is an octave. The next interval that's in the overtone series of any tone is a fifth, and then a fourth, which is the octave again, and then the third, and then another third, and all that just creates a major triad. So just that idea alone, grounding oneself in reality, and then pointing to the reason for that reality is that God created it that way, is just a good starting point. And then it's taking non-musical ideas in a sense of order and proportion and balance, to the way you go about composing music, when you're dealing with words, fitting the music to the words in a way that's appropriate to the style you're writing in. Of course, there are a lot of different styles one can write in. So a Christian approach or a non-Christian approach, in common grace, a non-Christian can write something that's taking Christian ideals of order, balance, symmetry, a proper use of dissonance and consonants, and create something, and you don't know if it's Christian or not. Like a pagan can cook a really good steak.
Yeah.
But if he cooks a good steak, he's doing things that are in good order. So whether he's thinking Christianly about it overtly or not, the principles are still there.
Yeah. Humans do have such an intense connection with music across cultures and across global boundaries. People are always drawn to and connect with music. Why is it that we specifically are wired like that?
Because we're created in the image of God, and God is a singer. It says in Zephaniah that he will rejoice over us with singing. We know that Jesus sang as he was God incarnate. And so being created in his image and then being called to do that, scriptures make it clear that we're supposed to sing to God, sing praises to him. We're supposed to let his word dwell in us richly in singing. We're supposed to be filled with his Spirit in singing. He's wired us that way. And again, if someone can be in rebellion against God and say, I don't think he exists, they're still wired that way. That's how it works. So it doesn't matter where you are, what you believe. That's true, and as you say, you see it.
Yeah, but there are other properties of God that we lost when we fell. Why do you think that music was one of the things that we still maintain?
I'm not sure I could say. I guess when we fell, there are things that we lose or lost, but more so it's that they just break down over time, or they're further from what they were in their pristine condition, pre-fall condition. And yeah, I don't know that I could say why I think that's any different than anything else. I'm not sure if I would say it is. Yeah, I'd have to leave that one there.
Do you think that the connection to music applies to other animals as well?
In a different way, yes. I mean, obviously there are some animals that do sing differently
in their own way.
Right?
Yep.
But bird song and others, whales and different things. As much as I love my dog, I never think of my dog singing, howling maybe sometimes. But Scripture makes clear. I mean, beyond just animals, if we don't sing praises to the Lord, creation will do so, and it does so in its own way. I mean, the trees clapping their hands. Well, they don't have hands. There's figurative language,
right.
But they do it in the way they've been created, because all creation's been created to give praise to its creator in the way that they're created. So, yes, but not in the same way.
Yeah. Do you think it was different before the fall, as far as like music and our connection to music?
I don't know. From the story we get, that's not a really long period of time.
Yeah.
And we don't have, there's the poem, the first poetry of Adam, this is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. We don't have a count of singing, so obviously so much wasn't developed at that point. Mm-hmm. Like their buildings weren't better than ours, in the sense that, as far as we know, there wasn't a whole lot of building that took place with Adam and Eve, or their clothing design kind of thing. So I would say probably if things had continued, well, yes, of course, there would have been greater understanding and more glory to it. but we don't have any account of that.
What is the purpose of music?
Our purpose, I mean, the purpose we have in it is to be able to express praise, joy, sorrow. On one hand, it's a vehicle to do things. So the word of Christ supposed to dwell in us richly, teaching and admonishing one another in songs and hymns and spiritual songs. It's a means by which this happens. It's a vehicle, but it also it instructs us. It shapes and forms us. We don't think that a whole lot in our society, but the ancient Greeks sure did. It was one of the central elements to training up a youth and by extension a culture. And Plato says if I paraphrase him loosely, if your music goes to seed in your culture, the political foundations of your society will crumble. And no one thinks that because perhaps our music is a little bit sketchy or edgy in our community or in our culture, that's one of the main reasons our politics and our political situation is so bad. You never hear that on CNN or Fox or Babylon Bee or wherever, I don't think.
It might be on Babylon Bee.
Maybe, I don't know. I don't read it very much, but those are some of the purposes of it. Obviously, to praise the Lord, to teach and admonish, to sing to the nations. But it's also, it doesn't have to have just a sacred element to it in the sense that we can use it for pleasure and enjoyment. That just tends to be the only thing people think of it as currently, is its background to make something light and fun, which is good. That's a good use of it. It's made for our pleasure in that sense, but there's so much more to it.
Right. You talked about the entertainment, the music of our culture kind of shapes and defines us. The culture today values very different things than it used to, and that we would love it to as Christians, and largely immoral and frankly stupid things. In what way does the music of today push that?
Well, it's not a new thing, right? It's been around in varying degrees for probably most of history at some level, but
people always sin.
But pop culture with the media element to it, the ability for it to be broadcast anywhere and at a click, and music that we can just consume and we don't have to make, that changes things compared to cultures where if you were ever to hear music, somebody in your presence was making it live. There was now it's a thing, you go by a pub or a coffee shop and live music, like that's a unique thing. Well, that was the only thing, pre-radio, which isn't that long ago. So I think that's one of the biggest reasons the musical culture is very different today, is not many people make music like they used to. So you read stories where, after dinner people would break out their violin, their guitar, their recorder, older versions of what we maybe think of today, but and someone would sing, and they'd sing 4-part music around the table, even in the wilderness. And if you read the Laura Ingalls Wilder books, Pa would get out his fiddle and people would dance. There's music making, and that's a folk music, but there's music making together, and it wasn't in the context where all that music is connected to a rock star. So most music that the general populace imbibes or has connection to is connected to a big star that's going on tour. You buy their album. Well, nobody buys albums anymore, I guess. But you buy their music, you listen to it, and it's about the pop star. It's not really about the song. Yeah. We don't want to hear generally someone else singing the Beatles songs or Elvis's songs. I mean, people do covers, but it's Elvis. He's old, obviously, before my time even. But it's about the rock star, and that. I mean, there were stars before.
Beethoven, Bach, but it was about their music.
It was about their music, and you can glory in the music of Beethoven, but most of the time you're not hearing Beethoven play it. I mean, some did in his time, but even in his time, he wrote it that others could play it, and that's a different thing. Obviously, people do cover tunes and play, but usually you just press the button and you sing along to the recording. You don't make it on your own.
Are there any benefits to that, though?
Yeah, there are blessings to the medium, no doubt. I mean, whether it's dealing with pop music or folk music or classical music, nearly the entire world has access to anything that can be bad, right? There's some stuff it'd be nice if people didn't have access to, but that's the corrupt usage of something. So it's great that anybody can hear a Beethoven symphony at a click of a button without having to assemble an orchestra. That's a lot more work to have people do that. But it's the downside is like the blessing of a microwave. Well, it's nice you can warm things up and you can put pre-made things in, and 2 minutes later you have your meal. But over time, the result of that, likely for many people, is nobody knows how to cook.
Yeah.
And so there's nothing wrong with the tool, but if the tool makes everybody duller or unable to do something by themselves, at the end of the day, it's not a good tool.
Yeah. Do you think that it cheapens the music to have such ready access to it?
I think in some way there's at least an element to it. I mean, I'm grateful I can search around, and I learn so much music by being able to click a button on my computer or my phone. But yeah, I think like anything, if you don't have to work to get to know something. So when I was younger, your age, there were recordings, but not of as much stuff as there is now. And so I'd buy scores of music, and meaning the printed music, not lots and lots. And if I wanted to get to know it, I had to sit down on the piano and read it open score. And that's how I'd get to know the music, was playing through it. And there's things you learn that way, or the stories of Bach. His older brother would have all of his scores, which would have been handwritten, in a locked case. And when Bach was alone, when his brother was out doing a gig, he'd get his hands through the grill work, and they were rolled up, and he'd pull them out, and he'd look at them to study, and he'd copy them by hand. And the process of doing that versus just going down to a Kinko's and Xeroxing it, which is a nice tool, but there's so much that he learned by copying by hand and having to look at it that way that there's no substitute for that.
Yeah. Do you think there are any benefits to the idealization of, the making an idol of the rock stars, and focusing more on them as opposed to the music they're making?
Yeah, well, we shouldn't idolize anybody. You can be really grateful for them and
look up to them, right?
Look up to them, love what they do. I mean, whether it's in my day with basketball, it was everyone wanted to be like Mike, right? He's the best basketball player, and imitation is a good thing. It's how we're created. We want good models at anything we do. So if you want to be a good basketball player, imitate Mike. If you idolize him, where you're willing to steal or kill to get shoes that has his image on it, as some people might want to do, well, that's bad. There's the story of Nero fiddling while Rome burned. Yep. Nero wanted to be the rock star. He wanted that adulation from the people that other musicians had. It's an age-old thing, and it's one of the when I talk about pop music, you can have a writer, the melody's fine. There's nothing sinful about the melody. The rhythm patterns, you can find them in classical music long before rock and roll was around. The chord structure isn't new or sinful, but there's a gestalt of it all. But what always strikes me is if you ever happen to be flipping channels on television and you come by Time Life, rock ballads of the 70s or something, and then you see all the clips of the concerts, and you see the physical interaction of the artist on the stage, doing things that most Christian parents would say, I don't think I want my son or daughter imitating that, dressing like that, acting like that. And then you see the tens of thousands of people, how they respond to every action of that artist on stage, and people wanting to just catch a drop of sweat from Elton John or Elvis or whoever it happens to be, or if they throw off their wristband, that's not good. You don't get that. I mean, this happened in classical music too. It's just not as prevalent, particularly now, but that was true of Liszt. People responded to Liszt. The young ladies responded to Liszt like they did to Elvis. It's just a whole different kind of music. So idol worship finds itself in any arena, but it does tend to be more prevalent, I think, in the pop side of things. Again, as you said before, it's the nature of the music culture there, where it's not the most famous performers in classical music didn't write the music. That can be true in pop music too, but you associate it just with that performer.
Right. Yeah. So where do we go from here? What's the ideal? What's the goal for us when we're, as Christians looking to develop a new culture?
Walking in wisdom is the the easy answer, I guess, but the hard thing to do. To change culture, to grow, to mature, to order our loves more rightly, more maturely, always means turning from things towards something else. And often the things we ought to turn from, or should, whether it's entirely or in part, in proportion and balance, are things that have holds on us. They have sentimental attachments to us. So whether that's someone who was an alcoholic, becomes saved, they know they shouldn't do that anymore, that still has a hold on them.
Right.
And they need to turn from it to walk faithfully. If it's with sexual interactions outside of marriage, that has to be turned from. Eating excessively is not a good and healthy thing. The way you speak to your wife or your children ought to look different. We still struggle with it where, when
We're
you're
fallen.
saved, we're fallen.
Yeah.
We're not going to be right all the time. With music, this is the hard thing, right? So you talk about alcohol or smoking or sexuality or those things, and most people will be like, yeah, you should turn from that if you're talking about a Christian worldview. When it comes to music, there's an old a song from, I don't know, the 20s, anything goes. And that's the way we think about it. Anything goes. What's the idea? What's the deal? So when someone, say a non-Christian, grew up listening to the music of Elvis, they become a Christian and they want to do music in their church. They still play the music of Elvis, they just change the words.
Yeah.
And there's a lack of understanding or maturity about music itself, because we think music doesn't matter, and that's not the way people throughout history have thought. There's a book I used to teach to the freshmen called "Why Johnny Can't Sing Hymns," and his thesis, bottom line thesis is, it's not that Johnny doesn't want to sing hymns and wants to sing Christian pop songs instead. It's that he can't sing hymns because they're as foreign to him as speaking Russian. He probably doesn't say it that way,
Right.
but they're just completely foreign. It's not even his palette of choices, because the only kind of music he interacts with is some form or multiple forms of pop music, whether that's folk, hard rock, rap. But in the stream of pop rock music, that's all he experiences. And he talks about his dad. He said, my dad growing up loved jazz, but he never would have thought that, hey, why don't we have a jazz trio be the music that leads our music on Sunday? You can like this, enjoy it, and it doesn't mean everything you do has to be jazz music, whether it's big band or bebop or what have you. And in today's culture, people like a style of music, And again, there's a variety of styles within pop or rock, but they gravitate to that, and that's what they do. Now, you can't fault someone for doing what they only know how to do. So if all they know is country, rock country, common day, and they're a Christian and they're leading music in their community, and that's all they know, they're not going to do anything else.
Right.
The biblical model is what we call, we do a music teacher training institute in Moscow here. It's 2 weeks every summer, and we've named it the Chenaniah Summer Music Institute. Well, Chenaniah was a Levite in the Old Testament, and he was over all of the music in the Levitical system. And it said he was leader in charge of all this because he was skillful. And you read the context, and I don't just take that to mean he was really good at playing the harp. So there are rock stars that are really good. They're really skillful at playing the guitar. But he was a Levite. He was trained in the Word of God. There's a maturity. He had the ability to lead and instruct. And that's what we're trying to do, is raise up Chenaniahs who have wisdom. And in the church, this usually doesn't get received well, but in that regard, there's not a lot of wisdom of knowing the church's history, of thinking biblically about music. It's, this is the music I like, this is the music I know, and I'm going to do it. And again, as far as that goes, there's nothing else one can do. But as the church matures, and we're 2,000 years into life
that process
after Christ, there is a history, there is growth. What music looked like in the year 40 is different than what the music looked like in the year 1040, 1600, 1900, 2024. And there's been highs and lows and growth and non-growth going backwards. And there's lots of cultural reasons for that. But when I first came to Moscow, I did a talk at NSA for a convocation, and I referenced the Ancient Treasure House chapter from, I always get this wrong, Prince Caspian. And the Pevensies go back and they find themselves in the ruins of Cair Paravel, and they don't even know they're in the ruins of Cair Paravel because it's so ruined. And they finally go down in the Ancient Treasure House, and they start recognizing all these dust-covered artifacts that were from their time. And they kept asking one another, do you remember? Do you remember? Well, they did remember, because they were there, of course, but Narnia doesn't remember. Most of Narnia doesn't think there were actual kings and queens of Narnia, the Pevensies. They don't really think there was an Aslan, and everything's in ruins. And I posit that that's the way the church thinks about its music. The church has the greatest storehouse of music in Western civilization, and it doesn't remember. It's like it's covered in ruins. And what's worse is I don't think most of them want to remember, because they like what they like. And, there's this great stuff in this ancient treasure house. Well, keep it in the ruins. We don't do that.
We have something now.
We have something, and we like it more. We think it's better. And musically speaking, it's just not better. Yeah. There are different kinds of music. It may be the best kind of pop music. Usually Christian music isn't the best kind of pop music, but that aside, even if it were, you can compare different things and say, this is actually objectively better than this. That's a biblical concept. So, I mean, the road ahead is, what we're trying to do is teach locally, train up children from the ground up so that they do know this, and they're connected to it from their young years. Which is where all that sentiment ends up coming. It's not to be sentimental, but you want it attached to them down to their roots. And then teaching the congregation. It's a slow change. You try to get folks that do get it. You want to model it. Like, if all of a sudden you see Pele playing soccer, and you'd never seen anybody but the bad the bad soccer that's being played in your local neighborhood, and you think that's what soccer is, or the bad news bears in baseball. If you think that's what baseball is because it's all you've ever seen, you probably won't like baseball. But then if you watch a great team play, you're like, oh,
I understand.
we gotta do something different because that's not what we're doing. So by doing the music camps we do, or the honor choirs, or what we're doing at NSA, we're trying to put models and examples of good music, historic church music, and new stuff too. We do new music, but so I write new music. I write contemporary Christian music, but I don't mean by that what most people mean by that. It's contemporary, it's Christian, it's biblical, but no, I use percussion, but not a trap set and electric guitar. I don't think those are sinful things, but we do modern stuff too, but it's in a tradition, it's connected to a tradition that's not the 1950s as its root, or even the 1920s. It goes back, 1,000 years, or even longer if you're thinking biblically, just in the thought process about it.
Where do you think the end goal is?
Heaven. I remember talking to one of my colleagues at NSA early after I came here, and I wish I could remember the whole of the conversation, but it was this back and forth about maybe more contemporary styles of Christian music, and I said, well, as much as I think Bach is kind of the pinnacle and the best that we've gotten in our Western history so far, I think when we get to heaven, that's not going to be as good as we think it is. I don't know what that's going to look like when we get to heaven and things are glorified. I think, Bach would still hold a place of honor for what he did in this world, in this economy. But if our bodies are glorified and better in ways that we can't understand, our music will be better and more glorified in ways we can't understand. But God does call us to continue to learn about his creation, truths in him, truths that he's revealed to us in creation, and then to work with them as we understand it and find out what it can do. And so we have the glory of buildings that are huge, and whether it's a grand cathedral or a big skyscraper, things like the pyramid, and that's going back a long time. Well, gosh, it takes understanding and wisdom to do that so it doesn't collapse. Brunelleschi's dome, or that you can fly from here to Europe in a big metal tube and it's not going to fall down. That's amazing, and that's understanding truths about creation, reality as God's given it to us. And we need to do that with music. It's fine to just write tunes, but there's stuff in the music too, and that's where when you get composers who are the ones we study historically because they've understood that maybe better than others, the goal is to look at what they did, to understand it, to stand on their shoulders, and to go forward and try to do better. And that, of course, you can understand it well, and you may not have the gifting of a Bach or a Mozart to do better. God gifts differently, but we keep pointing to the best examples and trying to continue in that direction. And right now, it really is a calling back. The whole classical Christian movement is the recovering the lost tools of learning. It's pointing us to things that were better than they are right now. The whole approach to education was very different than it is now, and we would say, all things being equal, it's better in its approach. That doesn't mean there aren't good teachers now, but we're trying to just call people back to it, walk in it, and everyone doing that movement in classical education, generally speaking, are all first-generation people doing it. We're starting to get some folks, a little older than you, that maybe grew up in it and then are going to teach in it. But you work that down 3, 4, 5 generations, it ought to look a lot better 5 generations from now if we've really done well and been faithful in it. And same with music.
Yeah. Why are Christians so bad at contemporary music, generally so bad at that?
Oh, well, I'll take a big broad brush on this. An awful lot of pop music isn't seeking for goodness, for glory, for edification
In its medium.
in its medium. It's not meant to be lasting. I mean, people like it if you sing their songs, but 3 decades later, but every week there's a new top 40 kind of thing. It's not meant to be lasting. They're not thinking about longevity in that sense. It's next album. But yeah, it's not seeking to bear Christian ideals and bless people in the sense that hopefully a Christian composer is. And so when a Christian takes music and its form is the kind of form that's not seeking to do Christian things by and large. Again, there's nothing sinful in and of itself of the stuff, but then they have to try to make it nice, more Christian, and there's a form and content problem. So if you take some song by Billy Joel, again, I stopped listening to pop music after the 80s, after I got out of high school. But you take a pop rock artist and you take the words out that they were singing and you put in the very word of God. You just put in the Bible. Well, that's worse.
It doesn't sound great.
Well, again, it's a form and content. The music is generally saying, snuggle up to your girl or spend all night with her or, be wild and crazy. And the text isn't saying that. And so there's this huge conflict of what you're saying with what you're doing. And so I think it's one of the reasons contemporary Christian music has so much trouble. There's just layers of, it's like waves in a busy lake where the waves keep bumping up against each other. They're not going together suitably so.
But there is a place for that, correct?
A place
for pop music, for that genre.
Yeah, within reason. I mean, again, some things I think, throughout history, there are things that ought to be cast into the sea. But no one ever wants to say what when it comes to music. Maybe we just ought to let that go rather than try to make it better. I mean, it's okay to have light music. That exists in the classical side of things too. There's music that's way more serious or meant for Sunday worship in a solemn assembly, and there's classical music that's meant to party to. Now, but what is it?
It was
mean
a
to party
different, yeah.
in a culture that might have music by Vivaldi being played by a live small orchestra in the background versus a garage band in the background. I mean, there's a whole. It's not just music. There's cultural layers that intersect with that music. We think the only option for a barbecue is to put on music of the Beach Boys, where we sing about wish they all could be California girls. I guess that's okay when you're on your boat, but if you stop and think about it for any moment, we probably shouldn't all be singing about all those different kind of girls who, keep you warm at night and all of that. But that's our whole heritage as a American culture is that's appropriate. Well, of course we don't want that for church, but is that what we want? And okay, if we don't want to sing about the different kind of bikinis that girls wear at different places at our Christian barbecue on the 4th of July, what do we sing?
Right.
And it's hard to navigate that playlist. So, and I'm not sure it's just contemporary Christian music either. I think there's music that can be secular, if you will. It doesn't have to be talking about God. That can have text to it. That can be lighter, enjoyable. Probably, I've never been the biggest fan, but maybe I enjoy a little more than I used to. Country music does a little bit more of that. It'll talk about things in life without being necessarily as crass or cavalier as other stripes of pop music. And so it's light, it's fun, it's sing along. Back before pop music, it was folk music, and you had cowboy songs, you had work songs. So people would sing while they worked on the railway. They would sing while they were out on their horses doing. I mean, some of the toughest people in our nation's history doing really hard work, or slaves on plantations, or doing hard manual labor, and they sang. And the kinds of things that they would sing in those kind of social settings is very different than the kinds of things we sing in our social settings. So some of it would be just a hearkening back to some of that. It seems weird and antiquated, but because we're not cowboys and it's a different era. But maybe if we sang more older folk music in our heritage, maybe it would start to morph into a different direction of what we do when we get together. Part of that, too, is that music was communal, and it was music that somebody got out a guitar and
It was live.
and we did it together. It wasn't, let's play Taylor Swift and everybody dance, or let's play Hamilton, or let's play the latest, whatever the latest rage is, and we all just sing along. I think we started making music, and we found music that was good. We'd enjoy doing it. That's my experience for my very first teaching job. If you do good stuff with people and you teach them about it, and you can do it winsomely and well, 99 times out of 100, people love it because it's good. It's like good food. If it's good food, they're going to like it. Sometimes you have to acquire a taste. I get it. I'm the worst at that. I have a very poor palate when it comes to eating. I wish it were better.
My parents tell me the same.
So, but you keep at it, and you keep going for good stuff. And yes, there's plenty of room for light genres. I just think right now we're at a place where I'm not sure I see lots of examples of people being really thoughtful in navigating pop music culture.
And also with consumption as well as creation. If oftentimes if the beat sounds good, or if the melody flows together well, you play it regardless of what they're actually saying.
Right. When I was in high school, it seemed like almost every song you listened to, there were all sorts of words you never knew what they were saying, and I usually didn't bother to look them up in the liner notes. You would just kind of sing nonsense sounds through things that you didn't care.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't really about the words generally. It was about the physical sense of dancing and
the feeling and the mood. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. But music has this power to kind of, regardless of the genre of music, it has a power to drag people in. How, you mentioned, or at least you haven't mentioned here, but you have before, and it's the reason I watched it, the singing revolution in Estonia. How is that kind of movement happening, or has it started happening?
Yeah, I think it's, in some ways, it's a pretty unique and rare thing. For that to have happened in Estonia, the silent revolution, the singing revolution, in the face of tanks and guns from the Russians and them trying to wipe out their culture, it's a culture war. Yeah. And they had a culture, and they had a singing culture, and they had this history of coming together for these choral festivals. This should blow anybody's mind in America, generally speaking. They would have hundreds of thousands of people from the whole country descend on the city to come for a choral festival, to hear tens of thousands of singers sing. The only place we do that in our culture, by and large, is rock concerts and big sporting events. And the numbers aren't even as big, because the biggest stadiums hold about 110,000 or so. So here you're talking about 200,000 plus people coming to listen to choral singing, not a rock concert. There's no star there. There's 10,000 plus singers up on the big riser thing out in the middle of a field. It's glorious. To me, one of the things I love about it is that's the best picture I've ever seen of the description before the throne in Revelation 4 and 5, where everybody's singing. There are different kinds of choirs. There's the 24 elders, there's the living creatures, and there's the people without number. But everybody's singing praises to the Lord as far as you can see. And that's the best picture I've seen of it. But that doesn't happen if you don't have a heritage. And there was some pop music elements related to that, but the thing itself was this this folk singing element in their cultural heritage. That would be a hard thing to do in America. We don't have that. We don't have common songs anymore. And our only common songs are songs by Elvis or the Beatles, who aren't from our country.
Or the national anthem.
Yeah, but even that, we don't sing. So, I mean, this is just a telling thing. When we do the national anthem in our country, it's by a pop singer who does all these ornamentation stuff in a pop style that you couldn't sing along if you wanted to. I mean, they actually have bets in Vegas now how long it will take someone to get through the national anthem at a major sporting event, because it's self-indulgent solo singer. You hear other countries at soccer events or at the Olympics, and everybody's singing, and they're singing it as a hymn, as an anthem. We don't do it as a hymn or anthem anymore. It's a pop solo extravaganza, and people don't sing. Very often, if I go to a baseball game, I will sing along to the national anthem, whether it's a pop singer or a, Sally on the violin from the local high school or whatever it is, or piping it over with a band. But sometimes my family gets a little embarrassed because nobody else is singing.
Right.
We don't, by and large, we don't sing as a people in that way. That kind of music, a hymn, an anthem. Of course, that's what you find in churches often, right? Particularly with the men. Well, the men don't sing. People are struck when they come to Moscow often by the singing in our churches, and particularly that they hear men singing. Now, it's not always very good yet. There's a long way to go, but at least they hear the attempt at singing. They hear men singing. They hear the room filled with sound, and that's striking. People come for a theological conference, and very often the thing they're most struck by is the singing at the conference, or coming to visit NSA, the singing at Disputatio. And there's plenty else that's glorious and grand, but there are people in other places that actually do serious lectures on literature or theology or history. That exists. This kind of singing where everybody in the school sings or everybody in the church is singing, that's really unique and rare. And so it's a glory and a blessing that's happening here in Moscow and in other places, CREC churches and ACCS schools, some better than others. It's a work in progress, but there is a growth in that regard. We're so spread out in the United States. It's not like in Estonia, where the whole nation's the size of Indiana. Moscow's a long way from New York City, from Florida, from Texas. So that sense of unity in that sense is harder to achieve, I think, in this big country of ours.
Yeah, but as far as Christians seeking to take back the culture, how does singing play a part in that?
One thing I would say is, this is a textual thing, but if you're singing the Psalms, whether it's a metrical version or chanting or through compose like I've been writing, just textually alone, most pop Christian music doesn't sing the word itself a lot. There are exceptions to that, but God attaches power and promises to His word, and if that word is what is dwelling in you versus the word of man, that's based on Scripture. There's still blessing there, but the words of Martin Luther are not as powerful as the words of God. Mm-hmm. No one should have a disagreement about that, whatever your denomination, if you're a Christian, right?
Right.
But most people sing more Luther or more, whatever hymn author they sing, Wesley, Watts, then they sing Scripture. So one is just that and it forms us as well. So, for instance, Watts wrote psalm versions, metric psalm versions, or hymns based on psalms. Well, Watts thought that there was a lot in the Psalms that was not Christian, and so he would leave them out, and he would or whitewash them, kind of, and I love lots of Watts' hymnody. He's trying to see Christ in the Psalms, and that's good and right. We should do that. But then to say, but actually these 4 verses in the middle of this psalm, we shouldn't sing those, because nobody in a post-Jesus time should sing those words. That's not something that anybody should express. That's dangerous, right? We need to sing the Word of God. That's what God calls us to. As we sing it in better forms as well, it's just more effective. It'd be like a sporting team having a better offense than running one play. Well, you can run that one play, that's fine, but all of a sudden this other team is running over everybody because it's just more robust. It's more fleshed out. There's more depth to it. If our music does that and weds with the Word of God, there's power in it. And the power is God's. It's not ours. We can sing the best music and be utterly impotent in what we do if we're seeking our own good, our own glory, and not the Lord's. Look at us. We're singing the greatest music the church has ever had, and if we point to ourselves, that's going to be ineffectual, right?
Yeah.
God may use it and bless other people by hearing it, but our efforts, the labors of our hands won't be prospered if we're doing it for our own glory and not His. But those aren't the only options, to either do bad music sincerely or to do good music insincerely or proudly. The better would be to do the most mature music you can as a people. As the Bible says, you shouldn't be sipping on milk anymore. You should be eating real meat. And the church has gone from, by and large, a big brushstroke again, it used to eat a lot more real meat in its music, and now it does a lot of sipping on Kool-Aid. That's what we do, and our communion is Kool-Aid often as well. We don't drink wine; we drink juice. We don't have strong meat for our music. We have Kool-Aid music. I like Kool-Aid; it's sweet, but
Yeah. Why have you mentioned earlier that Christians have, by and large, never done that?
The through composed.
Done yes, as far as like what we're doing here, and why has that not happened?
I don't know is the answer to that question. Sincerely, it boggled my mind when I started thinking about doing this project years ago that I don't think of myself as that creative or much of a composer. I do some composing, but I don't think of myself as a composer. And I think it's actually a blessing that I'm not super skilled as a composer, because I don't think I would want to have written simpler things for the congregation. I would have wanted to write more complicated things for advanced choirs. And nothing wrong with that, but that's what you do, right? I don't know, it baffles me that it hasn't been attempted. Now, since I started doing it, I have come across a couple other people in our time that have done a similar project. It's just their style of music is greatly different. So one where it was more in the style of kind of a Baptist youth style of music. Another where all the music sounded like it was from musical theater. So again, you could kind of tell the musical streams the composers were standing in. That's what they knew, and that's what came out. Mine, I would say, I was standing in the stream of chant, classical music, historic hymnody, even though I wasn't purposing to write hymns. Those are the streams I'm writing in and trying to take elements of them and craft them in a new way, but standing in a heritage, musically speaking.
Yeah. In your ideal world, would there be musical genres such as rap or grime or some of those more less melodical, less moving far away from the classical and more in the rhythmical world?
Maybe. I don't know much about grime, so I can't really comment on it.
I've never heard any, but I know it's a thing.
But it doesn't sound very good. So
Yeah.
I don't know. It's kind of like, is there ever a world where female mud wrestling is an okay activity at a Christian barbecue? I don't know. Probably not. So maybe not for grime. Rap, I generally speaking, I'm not a fan of it. What happens in it, it's just rhythmic speaking. There's not much melody. Sometimes you get little melodic fragments. And there are different kinds, and I just say my ignorance of rap because I don't follow it, listen to it. Most rap, it seems, tends to be wed to anger and countercultural movements and not edifying. But in a simple way, rap is not a lot different than chant.
Yeah.
Again, chant's not trying to be edgy and hipster. So if you can't work out edginess and hipsterness and trying to push against goodness or order in a society with the genre of rap, then I would say, no, I don't think we need that genre. But speaking rhythmically with or without a melody, there's nothing wrong with that. It surely can be done and has been done in a much better way that takes a lot of that out. But you don't see many examples of it. And the examples that are what would be considered the best rap, the best rappers, don't tend to be doing things that would be edifying, building up, glorifying the Lord, or other things that are worth glorifying in a non-idolistic way. So, yeah, I mean, I don't have a problem with any of it, whether it's that or country music or beach music, if that's a genre. But if that just means, do I think that there's a place where all of a sudden what we know of it at this point becomes acceptable? Well, then probably not. I mean, not everything. Yes, we want to redeem things, but throughout history, there's been plenty that God says, we don't do this in the same way the Old Testament did, but burn that down.
Right.
Destroy the Asherah poles. Now, I don't think we're supposed to go to Seattle and burn down every totem pole that we see, but God did say that, wipe things out that are not glorifying to Him. Don't do this. Our eyes are not supposed to consider things that aren't worthy to be beholden. And so I think there are musical styles that fall into those genres that let it go. We're not going to lose rhythmic speaking or more rhythmic music. If you listen to medieval music, they had these instruments that were like constipated oboes, rackets and things. It's one of the wildest sounds you've ever heard. It's visceral and guttural. They're still playing harmonies and melodies, but it's just this noise.
Yeah.
It's meant to be outside, not inside. And so outside it would carry more and it was effective. There's probably a reason those instruments aren't around anymore, because there's been better versions of them that don't sound...
I like the normal oboe.
Yeah, it just doesn't sound like, someone's trying to lay a golden egg or something while they're playing music. So it was what it was. It's okay that we don't have it, except for you can look back and say, oh, that's quaint.
Yeah.
Just like we don't build buildings like the 1600s in America. It's fun to go back to a recreation, or here's this old lean-to place, but the rain came through all of the roof, and the critters came in under the floorboards, and
no AC.
There's no AC. I don't know how they lived back in the South, 200, 300 years ago. But I don't think not everything needs to be carried on forever. So I'm okay if they don't. It's not mine to decide what will, or of course, but so generically, yeah, but not necessarily.
Yeah. Does classical music have any of the same kind of genre-specific problems that some of these other genres have?
Yeah, I mean, they're one of my favorite lectures is that I used to do in NSA. I don't anymore, but we'd look at madrigals from the 16th century, and musically speaking, there's nothing wrong with them. They're lighter, fun pieces, but the text in many of them, not all of them, but many of them, were kind of wanton love ditty kind of song. So Luther talks about when they start publishing 4-part settings of hymns during the early Reformation, he writes in the preface that one of the primary reasons that these songs are being put forth is so that the youth would have something to sing other than their wanton love ditties. Okay, so here we are in the early 16th century, and the youth were still singing wanton love ditties. Now, it wasn't Taylor Swift or...
There's nothing
fill
new
in
under the
blank.
sun.
No, it existed before. But maybe those wanton love ditties were something closer to these madrigals, and they're just getting underway then, too. So, but at any rate, I laugh because a lot of times you'll have Christian schools that have a madrigal choir, and they're singing things, and they have no idea what they're singing. It's like stuff in Shakespeare. There's so much bawdiness in Shakespeare and sexual innuendo. Sometimes we just miss it all. It's over our heads. We don't think that way in the language. So there's things like that. Obviously, there's. I don't think the problems, generally speaking, are as big as a lot of pop music. In the music itself, but as you get later in history and worldview starts moving more away from a Christian worldview, as you get into the 19th century, 18th, 19th century, you start getting not only more content issues, but also musical issues. So eventually you start stretching out so far from basic truths of harmony that you end up with atonality. And then they find it hard to exist in the world of atonality because there is no order, and the music sounds bad. And so Schoenberg and others create serialism. They create their own order, but it's not the order that's inherent in creation, and so it still doesn't sound good. They had lots of skill. I really respect Schoenberg as a composer. His structure, his approach to a composition is nearly as good as anybody I know. It's just he was working in a mindset that what most of it ended up sounding like was chaotic. And so, yes, there are problems in classical music. So much of the 20th century is just awful. But the 20th century is the son or grandson or great-grandson of stuff that was starting in the 19th century. Is not as bad yet, and this is where, one of the things I will talk about regularly is, yes, there are problems with pop music, all sorts of problems, but these kind of problems existed in classical music long before pop music as we know it existed. So form and content problems. You have composers writing masses, texts from the worship service, and they're writing them in a style that sounds like the opera. And the music itself is great. There's nothing wrong with the music. It's really good music, well constructed, well balanced, well ordered, and it just totally doesn't fit the text. It needs a different text, and it's not appropriate for that setting. So something being really good, lawful, fine, doesn't work. Pastor Wilson says regularly, a tuxedo is a better is better clothing than ripped jeans and a T-shirt. But if you're gardening out in 90-degree weather and it's raining, a tuxedo is not a very fitting or suitable suit, right? You want shorts or ripped jeans or whatever because you're in the mud. But if you're showing up for a wedding or for the worship of the Lord, coming in ripped jeans and a T-shirt with your favorite sports team or whatever, and your flip-flops, and grabbing a coffee in the foyer to come in and just kind of hang out and chill with Jesus, that's not suitable either.
Right.
People think it is because they have a wrong sense of what's happening in worship. We don't wear tuxedos either. We don't think that's exactly right for that setting either. And different cultures will have a different take on that. But within a culture, a society, not that it's all relative, but there is room for difference of expression. There is propriety and fittingness for different things. A jet engine is great when I fly to England in a week, and a scooter wouldn't be a very good vehicle. But if I want to get from NSA North to NSA South, a scooter would be a much better choice than a jet engine plane, right?
Practicality, yeah.
Right, and that kind of thing exists with music. I mean, the analogy only goes so far,
Right.
but it's still true.
So do you think the move is to try and reform pop music, or to try and change what we currently have and move everyone back or maybe forward to classical music?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think classical music is all we ought to be doing by any means. I think we ought to do more of it. You know, it used to be back when they only had 3 TV stations in the early days. During prime time, they had the NBC Symphony Orchestra. And long before there was Santa Claus is Coming to Town and Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and Frosty the Snowman and Charlie Brown's Christmas was on prime time every year, the first opera ever written for television, Amal and the Night Visitors. And that's what people used to listen to on primetime television in our not too long ago past, less than 100 years ago. And yes, I think we ought to listen to a lot more classical music. You know, even cartoons in my day reference classical music. You know, Kill the Wabbit. They're quoting Wagner. You know, it's funny, but people would get the joke because they listen to classical music as well. So there's nothing wrong with having a cartoon or spoofs on things, but there's no humor to that to anyone that would watch it now because they don't know Wagner. They don't listen to. Some might make the case you don't need to listen to Wagner, but yes, I think there would be a call to that. Reforming pop music, I don't know. I do like to think myself, and I'm not saying this is the right way to think about it, but I think we ought to be trying to reclaim folk music that we make together. Folk music and pop music aren't really any different in their essence. You have simple songs, a melody, refrain, maybe there's a bridge in it. It's not meant to be high music that's developed and working into developing the music like classical music often does. It's just you repeat it. It's simple. You have a couple verses, you got a refrain, and it's enjoyable to sing. Pop music, I mean, I think of pop music as folk music on drugs, different kind of drugs depending on the different kind of pop music.
Folk music after the
You know, I'm
60s.
gonna get in trouble for saying that, but my point being, the music's not all that different, really. I think we ought to invest more in a folk thing and let that regrow. You know, yeah, if pruning is an image that could be used here, I think a lot of it needs to be chopped back way further than a lot of people think it needs to be chopped back. And maybe actually it would grow differently if it were coming out of that, or putting it into, you know, taking it and putting it in a different pot of soil. Because pop music didn't grow out of Christian soil, right? You know, I know stuff existed before Elvis, but often we think of Elvis as kind of the start of this whole pop rock.
The blossoming, yeah.
And that wasn't Christian soil that grew up out of in any way, shape, or form. And I know Elvis sang some Christian songs now and then, you know, some Christmas albums or things like that. But it's anti-establishment. It's not seeking to be faithful to one woman all your life and to raise up kids in the fear and admonition of the Lord. And this is just fun music that we do in our Christian home. There's none of that. That's what it grew out of. And so I think we need to chop back further than people think it needs to be chopped back. And it's hard because, you know, like a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. And the devil doesn't come in a red suit and pitchfork. He comes as an angel of light. There's a lot of sweetness in a lot of pop music. I went to public school and I didn't have any sense of filtering in a Christian way when I was growing up. There's just tons of stuff I like because it's in me and I grew up with it. And there, you know, it seems like there hasn't been any really good pop music since the 80s, because anytime I go anywhere publicly, whether it was the fireworks the other night over in Pullman, or you go to the grocery store, or weddings where they play pop music afterwards, they tend to be playing music from the 70s and 80s mostly. And then eventually they get into some kind of grungy stuff at the end when all the older people have left and can't take it anymore. but they're listening to Journey and Chicago and, so I don't know. But there at least were melodies that were more folk-like back then, still really edgy and, again, folk music on drugs.
Right.
And you just read the history of so many people that were famous pop artists, and they were strung out, and they're on their fifth marriage, and
their lives are generally not great. No. But there are some people who would think that classical music, like, you should just be focused on classical music. What are the dangers of kind of only looking backward as to what happened in the past and how that was so great, as opposed to like maybe new genres of music or something new and glorious that we can create?
Yeah, definitely. We don't want to only look back. We certainly don't only want to do classical music. It's what I do mostly, but that's what I do. Sometimes people will poke at someone like me and say, "You just don't do much variety in your music. You only do classical." And I say, okay, so I regularly on concerts do music spanning about 500 to 600 years, from various continents, various countries, different languages, different genres. And why doesn't anyone get upset with the jazz trio or the big band or the country band? Because they only do one thing.
Country has not been around for that long.
That's it. But they only do country.
Yeah.
It's not like a country band breaks out and does bebop or big band or even other varieties of pop music. They do their one thing. And there's not much variety. Maybe you do a throwback and do an old 1970s country song or something from the 60s, but you're still doing country, and it's not that old. But again, it's what I do. I don't do jazz choirs. I don't do, but I don't think that's a bad thing or a wrong thing. So at any rate. We do need to look back to rebuild. If what we're doing is wrong, we can't just keep thinking we're going to get better by looking at ourselves. But we do need to create. So, singing a new song unto the Lord doesn't mean cut off your head from your body and then come up with something that's never been done before.
Right.
It's build off the past. Be thoughtful, be creative. And it will be new. It will be fresh. The same song is new every morning. The sun is new every morning. The mercies of the Lord are new every morning. And yet they're the same because God doesn't change, right? So we need to look back to have good models, because there aren't as many good models in our day. Someone asked, I was at a talk recently, and someone in the audience asked the speaker, who's the Bach of today? Who's the Beethoven of today? And he said, I don't really think there are any. And that's not to be unkind to anyone who's writing music, and that there aren't people writing good music in our day. But those are guys who stood in a stream of Christian growth. And Beethoven's not in the same way as Bach, but he's still living on the coattails of a Christian society.
World, yeah.
And he has inherited a lot. He's in a culture that valued something that was good and beautiful and had depth to it as part of its culture. Not the only part of its culture, but as part of its culture, that was seen as grand and glorious. And so God brought people that were at the top of that wave. Right now, we haven't had that kind of wave of centuries of people. So, Bach himself, his brothers were musicians. His dad was a musician. His grandfather was a musician. His uncles were musicians. There's this long heritage just in his family alone. And you see that with woodworkers or artisans of all sorts of things, where there's generations of things being passed down. And at some point, you get Michelangelo. At some point, you get Bach. We don't have that not just in a family, but in our society as well. We're cut off from that kind of Christian worldview that went through culture, not all perfectly and all that, but so but you know, the answer is to not do anything because we're cut off. I think that all the more is it's like when they find the book of the law and they bring it to Josiah, and well, they needed to look back. They needed to read what things are supposed to be like, and then they started making changes in their time to things. Some things needed to be done better. Some things need to be just entirely differently. I had no idea. Okay, we got to do this now. And all those things happen, and you do the best you can where you're at. You keep reading the Word. You keep looking to those who have done better, know better. There's a reason we keep going back and reading Augustine. Man, it's been a long time since he's walked on the earth. We keep going back and we read Calvin. It's not like, well, I read Calvin for 1 year in high school or 2 years in college, and I don't need to read him anymore. Or my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather read Calvin. We no longer need to be reading Calvin. No, we still do, because every generation needs to keep itself rooted in that. That's the biblical passing on to your heritage, training up in the admonition of the Lord, and that's true of the way you interact as a family, as a society, as a son of God, as a singer, as a musician. It's one part. It's true of everything we do, and so then you try to do the best you can in your time, and sometimes that's just building, growing, composing, as it were, and sometimes it's taking swings at things that need swings taken at. That's not an unusual thing in this town that we live in, where people take swings at all sorts of cultural things that
we're somewhat known for that.
Yeah, there are things that need whacking, but people get all upset when you whack at music, when you whack at a genre or a particular song,
because it's so deep inside of us.
And I think you mentioned it earlier, but I think that shows the power that music has inherently, which you see in I think biblical narrative, you see in classical pagan narrative with Orpheus and his lute, the power of music. The power of music exists in almost every culture, and I do think there is a power, a characteristic of music that forms and shapes us in ways we don't get, but nevertheless it does. And when you start pulling at that music, it's like someone's tearing part of your soul out, and you're like, whether it's a pop song that has no connection to the church, or you take a swing at some really bad church music. There's just music, it's not sinful, but it's just, blah, that's awful music. But my grandmother used to sing that to me.
Yeah.
Well, it may be, and I'm not trying to insult your grandmother or insult you, but that's a really bad piece of music. And it's because of a generation of that kind of music that we got to the next generation, and now we're where we're at. I mean, it's not like contemporary Christian just popped up out of the
trap and no one saw it coming.
Yeah, you can start peeling back the layers and like, well, yeah, that's still a hymn, but actually it's kind of more similar to carnival music than church hymnody, but it's in the form of a hymn, but it's in the style of carnival music.
Yeah.
And to us, it's so far removed, people often think of that as traditional hymnody. Like, no. That's the beginning of the the mess that we're in now, not traditional hymnody. The late 19th century is not traditional hymnody. You need to go back another 200-300 years, really. I mean, not that there's not good stuff that's been written,
right?
But in the main, yeah, a lot of bad stuff.
Yeah, there's a saying that to understand a culture, you must understand a man. And if we want to kind of understand why the culture and why the music that, influences that culture, and we want to take a whack at that, in a sense, we're taking a whack at the person who grew up in that culture, who's been influenced by that culture, and has been listened to that music and been shaped by it. And that's why people get very upset when you go after the things that they feel are part of their identity. As the entertainment world, as Christians seek to reform the entertainment world, and how does NSA and your work there come into reforming the music that we listen to and the way that we listen to it?
Well, I'm not sure I have a good answer for that, other than we're not trying to reform the entertainment world, because we're not doing the entertainment world. Not that I don't think music of musicals or of a lighter fare is wrong, but there's such a dearth of knowledge of the church's music history. I only have so many opportunities to do music in the concerts we do or what we're doing, and I want them to start learning that and loving that. And I think as we, in our lit classes, we don't read a bunch of trash from the magazine stand by the checkout. Can you read something that's light and
P.G. Woodhouse, yes.
Sure, you can do that stuff, but that's not what we're studying. And P.G. Wodehouse would be good still in its own in a different way, right? I'm talking about stuff way down the road from that. And we're just not doing it. I think we're doing something else. I'm trying to expose, not just expose, although that's part of it, but to do music with the students at NSA, so they have an experience that's different from perhaps their experience, certainly different from much of the world's experience, and they like doing that. And if they like doing it, they're going to want to do it more. They're going to, if they leave here and they go back to a different community, and then they start to see, but wait, I tasted this really good stuff and it was grand and glorious, and that's not what we're doing here. They need to enter in the conversation then about trying to build culture, change culture where they're at, or what they're going to do in their homes. So most students come to NSA musically illiterate. If I handed them a song from a hymnal or a piece of folk music, they couldn't read it at sight with their voice. They couldn't tell me that that's an A or a B, that's a quarter note or a whole note. Most students don't have much of that knowledge. Some have a little bit, but not a lot. And there are some that do have a lot, but the norm is musical literacy, because that's the norm in our culture. But they leave NSA being musically literate to a level, and now they have something. And when they graduate, we say to much
is given, much is required.
Thank you. They have something now. They have more knowledge, more insight. My hope is they'll, at the very least, pass it on to their children. That I tell them all the time, if I'm still alive, when your children come to NSA and they're as musically illiterate as you were when you came, then shame on you. You failed to pass on the gift that you were given to your children. You failed to give them the tool, the key, to interact with wonderful music, even simple music.
With like a different language.
Right. Why wouldn't you teach them to speak music? You're gonna make sure they speak Latin, right? And probably Spanish or whatever it might happen to be, because you have to live in this world. You have to speak Spanish because, you don't, but
yeah,
there are places
a lot
in
of
America
people
where it's like, and it may be a really great thing to do, because, gosh, 47% of the population in parts of the U.S. are, speak Spanish more than they speak English. Well, that's a good choice, so that you can love your neighbor, interact with them, But as we sing in Amazing Grace, when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. It's because that's what we see in the images of heaven, is singing before the throne of God. We know we're going to be doing it. Hymn writers sing about it. We sing it, we say it, and then we keep everybody in illiteracy. The early hymnals in America had music theory texts in the front of the hymnal, so they could teach everyone to be literate, to read the notes, the music that's in the hymnal. Now, we know that everybody's illiterate. We don't have any intention of teaching them, so we take the hymnals out of the churches altogether, and we just put the words on a screen. That's like going back to the Middle Ages, when stained glass windows weren't just there for beauty, but it was picture book kind of teaching, to give some memory to everyone who couldn't read, which was everybody, unless you were
in the papacy.
Right, or the rich, the princes and whatnot. Nobody read back then, right? The average person, nobody read, so you had pictures on to remind you. and that's the best we do in our music in church. Is we've gone back to picture books, but no pictures. We've taken the musical language out, and it's not that hard, but that's what we need to do, is be training up, educating, and people will want to do better things. At some point, doing the light, frilly stuff just doesn't seem as satisfying anymore, and there's a maturing that comes with it. There's no doubt that, generally speaking, the average teenage graduate at 18 is a wee bit less mature than maybe the average 16-year-old high school graduate who went on to Harvard or Oxford 200 years ago, fully speaking multiple languages.
Yep.
Right? They weren't so concerned with... sin's always been around, folly's always been around, the idea that the youth are foolish. Yeah, but this goes along with pop culture as being hipster, youth-centered. We want to stay in our youth culture. We have youth church. If you play any activities when you're a teenager or younger, it's only and always with youth. We're not trying to grow up. And we're trying to recover that in our midst, but culturally that's not where we're at. But when you see other things that are better, whether it's just better folk music, then act like a ding dong and bop along, because
Sounds good.
that's what you do with that music. That's what it's supposed to make you do, is kind of check your brain at the
Lose
door.
yourself. Yeah.
You don't want to do it anymore. I don't think we need to reform that to make light airheaded pop music more mentally stimulating. There's just other stuff that is, and again, I don't mean just classical music. There's plenty of folk music from different cultures. Man, it's just fantastic. I wouldn't want to do that either on Sunday morning. Who wants to bring in Celtic Irish step music into the church for Sunday morning? Maybe contemporary Irish kids do. Like,
it might be right there. Yeah,
maybe, but there's scintillating stuff there. Russian folk music. Oh man, that'll get you going. It's exciting. That's not my heritage, but it's fabulous music. I'd be excited if there was a lot of it played in our midst, just because it's great.
Yeah. I always like to ask, as we kind of wrap up, what's your biggest regret?
I don't know. I guess I don't think that way. I couldn't say my biggest regret. I mean, seeing so many that I teach growing up already in faithful Christian homes, it would have been nice that was my story. And I went to church, but it wasn't a real part of my home or my school upbringing. And been nice to have been further along sooner. But that wasn't my story. So, I mean, it's not a regret, because there wasn't anything I could do about it.
Yeah.
And look back and you can say, well, it'd be nicer if I wasn't in that situation maybe, but God uses your story and forms you. And there are things that I've experienced or know because I came through a different story. So, yeah, I guess I just don't think that in those terms too often.
Yeah. What's your biggest piece of advice to anyone watching?
Don't be afraid to sing. Sing. And if God gives you another 10 years or 30 years or 60 years, improve yourself musically. Because it's glorious. It's one of the great gifts of God. Martin Luther said music is second only to the Word of God, and a close second at that. And if I fill in the blanks from other things here, others would say it's because he says to be filled with his word richly in singing, to be filled with his Spirit, not drunk unto dissipation, teaching and admonishing another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. The call to sing in Scripture is great. And it's just a fantastic blessing. There's no rule that says you have to stop lessons when you are 18 and graduate from high school. It's a law that you must never take a piano lesson unless you're going to be a music major for the rest of your life. Don't let your kids quit piano when they start complaining when they're 12 or 13. If you're not going to let them quit math and history, don't let them quit music. It's a great and glorious thing. Keep at it, invest in it. For those that are further along and it's harder to invest when you get older, invest in your kids and dive into the pool. It's a glorious pool, and then seek to glorify the Lord in it, and seek wisdom and counsel from those who know more in our time and from other times.
Yeah. Where can people find you and your work?
You're in Moscow. Unlike you, I'm not a online kind of guy. I'm not on Facebook. Twitter or X or all those kind of I don't even know what they are.
Yes.
I do have an email, and I do have a smartphone, but I'm not very smart with it, so I don't make the use of it. I'm sure I could. But there's the Psalm collection that I've done. All of the 50 Psalms are all on Spotify, YouTube, any of the streaming devices. It's under a project called Cantica Sanctorum. And there's a publication of the music itself. Canon has that right now, and we're about to. A colleague of mine, former student, we're about to, in the coming months, start a new publishing company for music, focusing on choral music, church music, and the first thing we're putting forth is a piano edition of the Psalms. So not just the chords and the melody, but written out piano parts. So we're running a GoFundMe right now to try to get that off the ground, but the whole publishing company, which would be called Pretorius Publications, which most people won't know what that means, but Pretorius was one of the most prolific Protestant composers in history, and if you don't have folks like Pretorius, you don't get a Bach downstream of him. So that's why we've named it that. So those would be some things to look up, and the NSA website, if you look under music there, and some of the things we're doing, the high school honor choir and the local music camp and the music teacher training, the Chenanaya Summer Music Institute, and then local stuff, the Schola Cantorum for those that are in Moscow, trying to train up kids. That's in the homeschool realm, because the day schools already have that going. But yeah, checking out the NSA music website, it's a good place to go.
Yeah, I'll put links in the description.
All right. Great.
Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
See you guys.